Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. Today we have a very, very special guest on. I'm very excited. As people know from watching the channel, I'm a huge Arsenal fan, and we're talking to a legend of the club, 23 years at Arsenal. He's humble, but former head of medicine at the club and current director of the Lewin Sports Injury Clinic. We've got Colin Lewin on with us today. We're going to be talking all about Qatar 2022 and the impacts on the injuries of players. But first and foremost, Colin, how are you doing today?
All good, thanks, fellas. Thanks for having me on. All good.
Are you excited for the World Cup? It's only a few days away, or do you have mixed feelings like some other people do in the footballing community?
Yeah, listen, it's a football tournament, so I'm looking forward to seeing some of the games. But you know, we're working here and missing a few of them. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. It's an odd one. It's an odd one.
Yeah, well, this is what we're going to talk about today because it's odd for many reasons. It's the first mid-season World Cup, and this is going to affect injuries, players in so many different ways. And I'd actually like to start off the discussions maybe pre-season, before even we're talking about the tournament. What kind of changes would you have foreseen that clubs, even players themselves, are going to change for this World Cup? The pre-season, in-season training patterns. What would have been different this time to maybe other summer tournaments?
As in this pre-season just gone.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not
building up to
sure.
this World Cup.
Yeah, I'm not sure a great deal really. I think the season did start slightly early, didn't it? And everyone would have been well aware of the fact that there was a bit of fixture congestion. They were putting a few games in, so there was pretty much a game every 3 or 4 days, wasn't there? But I don't think any club would have said, right, that season looks a bit more congested. Let's do something different pre-season. I think there was no real summer tournament as such. Am I being
Mm.
stupid? Was there a summer tournament?
No. Yeah. Do you know, for me, Colin, and this is a question that we get asked quite a lot. How real is that sort of club versus country, debate in terms of, domestically, obviously managers, coaches, back, you're all judged by results ultimately.
Yeah.
And how much of that internally on domestic football are you thinking outside of that with regards to players going away with the national team? Because there's a general feeling from me that I'm just thinking, well, do you know what? I'm not really bothered what my players go and do at these international tournaments, because I need to make sure that what we're doing on the pitches here and we're winning games in the Premier League to try and, keep yourself in a job. Is that real, or, are conversations happening, or allowances being made in terms of, ensuring that players going on the national team in the best health and fully fit?
I think it's managers, medical teams, S&C coaches. I think they'd be more concerned about what state they're going to come back in. Obviously, they'd like them to go in a decent state, but they're going to join up with their international teams, and they're going to be at the whim of that coach at that national team who may train them in his own way. You're not going to be able to control that. He'll be looked after by the physios that are there, the S&C coaches that are there. And so, yeah, the club versus country thing is definitely real, but everyone's just pushing for their piece of that pie. The clubs, when I was doing it, the clubs our end were doing what we could to try and make sure we can get the players back as quick as possible afterwards. Sometimes a jet was put on to get the South American boys back quickly after a Wednesday night game, which has now gone to Tuesday night, quite rightly. So yeah, we would always push our side, but of course we understand, and we have to understand, that the medical teams at the national teams are also doing their best to help their manager and push their side of things as well. So they want the players quickly. They want as much information from us as we can. So I think everyone's pushing their side of things, knowing it has to stay civil most of the time, and knowing that you have to have a bit of understanding about your colleague at that national team. He's doing his best to try and help you where possible. Don't forget, with England, I Gary, my cousin. So that was a very easy relationship in my 10 years at Arsenal. I was chatting and communicating with an England medical team that I knew very well. But I can't say I had a great relationship with the fellas I'm picking on one country, which is wrong, but Ivory Coast, for example, my relationship wasn't so good. I didn't have a great communication with them, whereas some of the European teams, France, Spain, the communication was very, very good. Switzerland, for example. So you're doing your very best to maintain as much communication as you can so that everyone's happy and everyone knows what's going on. And you'd hope there's a little bit of openness around each player's condition and availability for those games.
Sorry, Jason. I was just going to say, just to follow on, would you say it's a lot more of a collaborative approach now to players' health, well-being, fitness, than it was back then? And examples that have cropped up in recent times is you've seen sort of members of the backroom staff at Manchester City, for example, traveling with Erling Haaland while he's away with the Norwegian national team, and in monitoring his load and managing his sort of day-to-day actions in training to ensure that ultimately, he's away, he performs, but then comes back in the best possible shape.
Is that collaborative? Or is that Man City saying, we don't trust what you're doing? I don't know. The Man City will know that. But I think, it's definitely better. But it's so individual. There'll be certain, like I said, certain countries where you had a great relationship, where you completely trusted what they were doing, the openness, the communication, things being sent to you afterwards, summaries of the training camps with GPS data on it. Sometimes you got great feedback afterwards. Sometimes you got absolutely nothing. And that a player would come back from a country injured and you would have no idea. There was someone rang me once, said, I see Sanchez has hurt his ankle in South America. I had no idea. Someone had put something on social media with Alexis Sanchez ankle in a game ready. And I had no clue. And he came back to us a few days later with a fairly significant ankle injury. And we didn't hear once from that country's medical team. So it really is an individual basis. Some of them are fantastic. Some of them could be better.
I want to talk about as well, bringing it to maybe this preparation period. And we're building up into the World Cup now in terms of players are out there, they're training. But all through the course of the season, there's been discussions, are players psychologically going to turn off a little bit towards they head into one of these tournaments? Now, historically, maybe the only example that we have of in-season tournaments maybe affecting the psychology of players is African Cup of Nations. And, Ben's kind of highlighted it at the start. Managers, clubs, their interest is Premier League or Ligue 1 or wherever they're working around the world. That's their priority. Whereas Brendan Rodgers recently explained his thoughts that he believes that players will give their best for the club, but there's no doubt in the back of their mind that one injury could keep them out. You could argue and say it could be the same at the end of the season, but you get that buffer. And that's why all of us thought the timing wasn't ideal. Do you agree that psychologically, maybe some of the players might have pulled back a little bit, maybe not given their all in this first half of the Premier League season?
Tricky one. Again, could be individual as well. I bet there's some players that haven't held an ounce back. I bet there's some players who, if they're honest, may have held a little bit more back. Does that depend on how their club's doing, their relationship with that club, their contract situation? Is it their last World Cup? Is it their first World Cup? I think it's so hard to generalise on that. And also, secondly, to prove that. I think to even suggest that any player has held back a little bit, it'd be so hard to prove. Psychologically, almost subconsciously, did it happen? It's difficult to know, isn't it? Difficult. I mean, did players put a bit less in those last couple of games? I'm not entirely sure that's the case. But let's count how many times we say the word unprecedented in this podcast. It's going to be said once or twice, isn't it? The truth is we don't know. I don't think so, is my answer to that. But after the event, if you had good honesty from a lot of players, I bet there's a few that would say, perhaps in those last couple of games, I was very nervous about being injured. Does that mean they held back? I don't know. They've been nervous, perhaps. But like you say, the African Cup of Nations was always January. Did I ever see an African player hold back in the game or two before that tournament? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, is that ever addressed psychologically within the club? We always talk about sports psychologists, would there be somebody noticing that maybe a player is a little bit off and just kind of intervening, being proactive, or would that be player-led, feeling a bit nervous, kinesophobia, things like that just before the start of a tournament?
Again, I think it's individual basis. I think it all comes down to conversations as well. I'm sure Arsene Wenger in my time would have been having conversations with our African players before that tournament. How they're feeling, trying to talk them around as an amateur psychologist. By amateur, I mean there are qualified people. An amateur psychologist trying to do his best to get the best out of those players and trying to take their mind off the fact they're on a plane straight after the game out to an African Cup of Nations tournament. But I remember all the time, it happened a lot with the Kolo Toure, Emmanuel Eboué, Lauren for Cameroon. We always knew that after that game, they were jumping on a plane to what was a really important tournament to them. So did it affect them psychologically? It's so hard to prove, isn't it?
This question I have been asked fairly often over the last certainly on to build up the World Cup, and a good example was my hometown club, Kieran Trippier, down at St Mary's. I think during the first half of that, went down with an apparent hamstring problem, stretched it off during that halftime break. If he had any doubts in the back of his mind, he could have been replaced and nobody would have batted an eyelid. He came out second half, he played, and it was Eddie Howe that made the decision to remove him. And then he plays in the Carabao Cup against Crystal Palace, midweek. So, I think you're absolutely right there in terms of the, it's down to the individual. What I would say with regards to that final weekend, we did see an unprecedented, we certainly did see a spike in the number of players that missed out due to either, what were reported as illness, fever, gastroenteritis. I haven't correlated that information year on year for this particular weekend, but we certainly saw a large number of players absent from game week 16 because of, they weren't feeling too great, let's just say.
But also, if you're the manager, do you want someone on that pitch half-hearted? If you've got any inclination that a player was going to go onto that pitch a bit cagey and half-hearted, wouldn't you want the next best person to go in and who isn't perhaps at the World Cup, who's going to give 100%? These are all the situations that managers and medical teams have every week. Conversations around that sort of thing. But it's, you're right. There might be an increased number last weekend.
I do want to bring it back to that African Cup of Nations kind of example. Do you think that this is going to be almost the playbook that a lot of teams will be working off of in terms of the load management of those players? Are they going to look and go, right, mid-season tournament, we have some experience with African Cup of Nations, but, I'm going to say it, is it unprecedented, with players coming back in such vast numbers, because it's huge numbers of squad numbers now. African Cup of Nations, some clubs, 3 or 4 players, whereas you look at the likes of Manchester City, Arsenal, pushing for league titles, but lots of their players are going to come back fatigued. How does that squad management happen?
Again, quality, experienced people, I would say. In the England medical setup and the S&C side, there are good people there who had probably had long chats with each other and the manager and the coaching staff around what their plans are going to be. Everything would have been meticulously planned months ago. Would they have got some advice from some of those teams in the African Cup of Nations? I wouldn't have the foggiest, but they had their own ideas about it. I mean, you're probably going to come onto this later, but is it better that we've got players going to the tournament having only played last weekend, as opposed to going to a tournament having not played, friendlies aside, having not played competitively for what can sometimes be 3-4 weeks? So I don't know what's best. Having said that, after the tournament, we still might not know what's best. But part of me thinks that they're still in the groove of training and playing from last weekend. So there's no real mini pre-season, if you like, or preparation phase that those coaches and fitness coaches have to worry about. They're all going almost fully primed, with the exception of 1 or 2.
Actually, you bring up a point, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because we've heard a lot in the media with regards to players being overloaded, and we're expecting injury rates to spike, and FIFPro have been very vocal with regards to player management. Is there an argument that, you know, these players, in fact, we might see incident rates actually reduce if we compare the same period of time over the, say, Premier League, for example? So those players involved in European football, the Manchester Cities, the Liverpools, Chelsea's, you know, ordinarily during this period of time, they would play on average somewhere between 9, 10, possibly even 11 games. And then you're heading into that congested festive fixture period. Now, for those players who are going to be involved in out in Qatar, you know, even if you get to the final, I think it's only, is it 7 matches? For the majority of players, you know, they're only going to play maybe 3, 4, 5 competitive games. So is the argument actually they're going to be in a better place to attack that second half of the season than they would had they not been, you know, this tournament arranged in the middle of the campaign?
I was going to say the same thing, yeah. Especially if you're talking about the teams out in Europe, those players are probably going to go and play less games. So we're talking about a congested period. It's probably going to be less. No, I agree with you. I think for the majority of players going to that World Cup, unless you're in the semis or the final, that's still a lot of players, but unless you're in the semi or the final, every chance you're going to play less football than had the World Cup not been on in that period. So yeah, I agree with you.
And so there is the concern, and we had this last year with the Euro 2020 or 2021, what it was. And one of the players that come to prominence at post-tournament was Dominic Calvert-Lewin. And he was a player who was obviously away with the England squad, had very little game time. In fact, he mightn't even have played a competitive minute. So therefore, he was on the fringes of that squad. You're never really getting that intensity of playing and training regularly. He misses the bulk of that preseason program with Everton. He then returns with, you know, less than, I think it was around about 10 days until the start of the season. He doesn't have that opportunity to adapt, to build up that level of fitness because he's been away. And then all of a sudden he breaks down and he suffers one setback after another. And we're still seeing the repercussions of that maybe, you know, 13, 14, 15 months later.
You said it all there. I think you're right. You're going away and you're getting, underloaded is a strange term, isn't it? But yeah, you're getting underloaded in some respects. So we know that, you know better than most, that the injuries tend to occur around changes in load, and whether that's overload. And FIFPro are quite right to highlight it. I understand what they're trying to say. We know Vincent Gutabars really well at FIFPro, and he's trying to do some good stuff. So they do highlight in that document they've done recently, the overload, underload can also just be quite as damaging at times. But the example you've used there, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, again, wasn't ideal, was it? Because he almost did less than what you'd have wanted him to do.
Yeah.
It actually brings us nicely onto the point, again, something that Ben and I have discussed off air many times, is how are clubs going to manage this period? You know, as you said, they're underloading, the kind of conditioning of players. You know, not every player is going to the World Cup. Not every team has lost their whole squad. And so some players are going to lose that match sharpness. And for example, the Bundesliga is basically gone for 2 months. Does that put them at a disadvantage, the players who aren't actually going, who have basically a month off? I mean, how do you even keep that match sharpness going?
There's a couple of questions there. The first one, how are clubs going to cope with this period now with players who aren't going to the World Cup? I only know about a couple of clubs, so I can't speak for them all. But I would guess they're going to give the players a bit of time off. Be that 10, 14 days, I would think. And then they're going to go and do probably a mini pre-season. You know about a lot of teams that are going to Middle East and other places to go and do a little bit of training to get them primed again to go back into that Christmas period. So, yeah, you can't just give every player that's not at the World Cup a month off, mainly because the games start again on Boxing Day. So I would think the majority of clubs are going to be short rest period, mini pre-season, get going again. And there'll be things put in place for the players that are at the World Cup. If you go out in the first round, In the group stage, you come back to us on that date. If you go out in the second or the quarter final, you come back on that date. That's what we used to do. I'm sure that's what the case is now. There'll be a set period of time that they will give those players off after the tournament. Bundesliga-wise, yeah, I'm not entirely sure why they've gone for that extended period. Sure, they'll have their reasons. Can they go later in the season? Have they got less fixture congestion than us, so they can afford to do that? I don't know why they would do that. It seems a long time, doesn't it?
Yeah, but is there a risk there of damaging Bundesliga, maybe chances in European competitions as well because of that?
I don't know. I think if the clubs handled it well, I used to work with a really good S&C coach called Shad Forsyth. He's currently at Dortmund. So I'm sure he's got plenty of experience in dealing with these sort of situations. So he'll be advising coaches on what a squad would need to do in that period. I'm sure they've worked it out very carefully. But again, it's individual basis, isn't it? Some players may just be back from a long-term injury, don't need that time off. But I think, you just have to rely on quality people planning as best they can to make sure that everyone gets what they want. But it's certainly not ideal having players finishing now and going again on the 20th.
Colin, you touched upon it just briefly there with regards to obviously players having that break and then returning for that mini pre-season program with several clubs have been fairly open that they'll be returning, involving some warm weather training. The guys at Newcastle will be heading to the Middle East. But one of your North London rivals, Tottenham, Antonio Conte has taken the decision not to travel abroad. Is that a strange decision, just given the modern game that everybody else seems to be going abroad and getting that little bit of sun on your back? And what maybe were the sort of influencing factors that maybe led him to make that call to keep his players in London and not travel, do you think?
I don't know. I think he's a very experienced man. Not sure we can question him too much on those sort of decisions. But listen, Tottenham's training ground is going to be one of the best in the world with great quality pitches. All I can think of that's missing is the team being away together for that togetherness idea and the sun. I think everything else there, they've got everything they need at their training ground. So I don't know. Have some of the clubs taken the view to go out there to play games? Has there been some commercial reason that some of the clubs have gone? I'd be very surprised if there's not. I don't know. I'm not that surprised that some clubs have decided not to go anywhere. I'm not that surprised.
I want to bring it to the preparation, the togetherness of the national teams. I want to bring it to the attention of how is the build up to this tournament going to be different then? Because as you said, usually it's like a month or 20 plus days to build up into a tournament. So what would be the new kind of training system for the teams? What kind of setup would be there, and what will be missing from the usual stuff?
I think it'd be very similar, just far less time. I'm sure the coaches would love to have a longer period to be with the players on a pitch and get what they want out of them. A couple of friendlies would have been probably quite nice for those coaches and manager, I would guess, but there's no time for that. It's literally 7-8 days, is it, between last Premier League game and first World Cup game. So nothing's going to change except for the fact they're not going to have the same preparation time on the pitch with those players. So I'll guess they're going to have to congest that. Fitness coach-wise, medical team-wise, the beauty about a World Cup is you're going generally with fit players. So I've never done one, but speak to lots of physios that have and communication with them all the time. As a physio on a national tournament, international tournament, you hope you're taking 25, 26 fit and well players. So hopefully all going to be on the pitch. I know there's one or two that aren't at the minute with England, but you'd hope they're all going to be out there. So not a lot's going to change apart from the number of days they have to prepare those players for the first game. I can't think what else would really change, because they don't need to have that let's get them fit period that they might have for a summer tournament. I say fit, sharper.
So given that it is a congested period and everything is condensed. So everything is amplified. The turnaround is much quicker. Should we be overly concerned, for example, that James Maddison has missed his second day of training with the squad as it currently stands, with this ongoing knee issue? Now, we know it's something that has been affecting him in recent times, and it's about managing that load. And he's obviously, they must be confident enough that he will be available for, maybe if not the Iran game, maybe the second or the third group fixture. But because of just that such a quick turnaround, is this more of a worry that you cannot really carry too many players who are carrying those little knocks and niggles? Could be, it could have a massive impact down the road.
Well, don't forget James Maddison played, not for long, but don't forget James Maddison played a week ago. So it's not like it's in a summer tournament where someone may have played their last game on May the 7th, May the 10th, and here we are now, early June, thinking, can we get him right for that first game? He only played last week, so I wouldn't have thought there'd be much in the way of drop-off in his condition. I mean, again, quality physios, quality fitness coaches and people at England to be making those decisions and looking at the risk analysis around training James Maddison in the last few days and agreeing with the manager that it's probably not worth the risk. Obviously, we're speculating, but I would think that's what it's going to be based on. But the biggest thing in the background will be, hang on, fellas, he played last week. So let's not be too concerned about a big drop-off. Whereas if we were talking about this now in a summer tournament, a couple of days before the first game, and someone hadn't trained for weeks, that's a different conversation, I think.
I want to continue talking about how often these players are playing. Going to bring it back to the aforementioned FIFA Pro analysis. One of their kind of conclusions was players are being forced past their limits. With the example, interestingly enough, Sadio Mane was used, appearing in 93 competitive matches since the beginning of last season. Do you agree that there has been a general failing of a lack of provision of effective safeguards, as the report says? Are we entering a bit of a dangerous territory for the number of games players are playing, whether or not this World Cup was mid-season or at the end of the season?
How much is too much? I know it's such a difficult question. And again, I don't think you can apply it across the board to every single footballer shouldn't play more than 60 games a year. Such a hard thing to generalise on. We are expecting more from them physically. We know that. There's data sets around sprint distances in games, number of sprints, distance covered. We know that is increasing year on year. I haven't seen the last few years, in fact, but prior to that, it was increasing year on year. So we know we're expecting more physically from them. But do they then adjust training to accommodate that? With them not looking at the well-being, mental health, psychological side of things? It is such a minefield. I really don't know what you would do. Imagine you've got a player to sign something that said, okay, we're never going to play you more than 50 games a season. But because of that, here's your wage cut. It's a real tricky area to say that we shouldn't play anyone more than a certain number of games, because we haven't got the data. We haven't got the knowledge yet. Perhaps we will in the future. But there'll be lots of players that are regularly getting through 60 and 70 games a year with no obvious visible issues. There may be some. I mean, it's a hard one. I think you do have to manage your players individually with open communication with that player, with strength coaches, with managers, with medical teams, psychologists. We've got such an army of people behind the team now. And why that does encourage too many opinions at times, you have to weigh everything up, and it can't be a generalization. I don't think we can make statements like players are becoming overloaded. I think you can say those particular players have done quite a lot. It's a really hard thing to generalize.
I think, we're discussing Sadio Mane and some of the data we've looked at with regards to Mane and Mo Salah. We've discussed this before. When you chart their injury setbacks throughout their career, those tend to occur when they have a low amount of rolling minutes in their legs. So it tends to be when they're playing less minutes, they pick up the injuries. But when they're that perception of being in that red zone when the perception is they're being overloaded and asked to do too much. They're performing and they're continuing to perform without, like sort of any overtly obvious issues. So I think you're right there. It's difficult to really generalize across the board, because there are some players who can maintain. I think you don't have to look too far past the Lionel Messi's and the Cristiano Ronaldo's of this world, who, delivered consistently at a high level, 50, 60 plus games every season for 10 plus years.
Some players, I think, will see it as, I've done a bit too much. I'm playing a lot of games consecutively and finding it tough. Some players feel like they're in the groove. Some players would hate to play 2 games, miss one, 2 games, miss one. I mean, what does in the groove mean? I just made that up. But you know what I mean? You're in that playing, recovering, easy training, playing, recovering, some training. Again, it can't be considered as a generalisation. It can't be a team has done too much. The team is the sum of those individual efforts, really. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, as medical teams, I've said this a lot, we are literally gamblers, risk analysers. And we just give opinions to coaches and players and everyone else around us as to what we think is going to happen based on our experience, some data sets, obviously, around what we think that risk is going to be, because we can never be sure. We're never going to get that risk down to 0.
And is that, when you were in football, did you find that risk was being amplified by stakeholders, just the vast amounts of money that was involved in the game, that, these stakeholders and everybody involved in football always wanted more and more and more. And therefore the pressure, sometimes unfairly, was put on yourselves, to try and give that definitive answer when you never really could. You cannot give any guarantees.
I don't think so. I think we were quite lucky that we had a lot of stability at Arsenal. And with that comes a lot of trust in each other. And so I think we were always very honest, and, we give opinions. And if those opinions aren't listened to, so be it. We're there to offer the advice. Same as everyone at that club. It all comes down to one man's decision, along with the players' thoughts, of course, about what happens for a training session, a match, or sometimes a very important match, be it a Champions League game or a cup final. And that's when the risk analysis needs to be a little bit under the microscope, because it's a very, very important decision, as opposed to a league game or a Carling Cup game, whatever it was called, Carabao Cup. There were just different decisions then sometimes. Yeah. But no, I don't think the stakeholders ever got really involved at all at Arsenal. It might happen elsewhere. We were very lucky in that we had quite a tight group of people that trusted each other, and we came to decisions and risk analysed things on a every game basis. Didn't always get them right, but we all gave our opinions, and the manager generally, can't think of many exceptions, trusted us.
Yeah. And one final one, because I know Jason will want to move this conversation forward, but we touched upon Sadio Mane. Unfortunately, we just had the news that his tournament in Qatar is now over. He had surgery on Thursday evening to reattach a tendon to the head of his right fibula. Can you give any sort of indication for those who are obviously worried, and particularly those Bayern Munich supporters who are wanting to get him back in their team physically, on what sort of recovery, what that rehab process, may look like, and when we could maybe expect to see him back on the pitch?
Sorry, fellas, but I've absolutely no idea what he's had done. I'm going to have to say no. No, I can't have a clue what surgery he's had. I don't know what the background or the situation was. So I'm going to duck under that one. No, I've got no idea.
I actually wanted to bring it on. We've talked a lot there about managing loads and discussions, stakeholders, but I want to actually bring it to the attention of the players themselves. In these situations, how often are players going risk reward situations? How much are they involved with these calculations? Because I don't know how much you can say, I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but one player that I always think of who pushed the limit was Alexis Sanchez. You've mentioned him already with the kind of Chile situation, coming back with a knock, but for me, he was always a fantastic and amazing role model because he pushed himself. But then there was also sometimes criticism from fans, from kind of analysts that maybe he pushed himself too much, put himself in danger. So how often do players kind of override the medical advice and go, I'm going to play the full 90, even though you only want me to play the first half or the second half when going on international duty?
On international duty? Okay, yeah, once they're out that door, it's difficult to control it. I think managers having chats with players before they go, us having chats with medical teams when they're with them is always hopeful. It's always, this is what we would like. But you can imagine international teams could be getting 22 calls about 22 players saying we'd like him to play 45 minutes. Now, that's not possible. So I think we just do everything we can to advise, educate and cajole, really, players into understanding that 45 minutes in that friendly match in Australia, which is where France went once after winning the World Cup, isn't that important when we've got a game on the Sunday in the Premier League against a really difficult opponent. So, yeah, the player plays a massive part in it. And we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. If Alexis Sanchez wants to play 90 minutes for Chile in a really big game, and he may have very good reasons for that, he's going to play 90 minutes. So, yeah, we did our best to help them. We did our best to educate them. But if they come back, we used to sit and watch the TV on those Tuesday and Wednesday nights. All the international stuff was coming through. You're looking at it on the internet. You know, a player goes off at half time. You're thinking, is he injured, or has he followed our instructions from Arsenal to come off? And then I used to get a text message from every player in the few hours after the game finished. That was a rule we had, that they would text me and let me know how they were. And you're literally looking at your phone waiting to see what's going to come through. Hopefully they're saying, I'm fit and well. See you tomorrow night, or whenever they were coming from. So, yeah, it was a difficult thing to manage. When you had the African lads and the South Americans, back in the days when the second game was on a Wednesday night, they used to walk through the door of the training ground on a Friday lunchtime. Now, we could be getting on the bus 2 hours later to go to the north of England to play a game on the Saturday. So very often Arsenal was of the opinion that they don't land till 8 o'clock this morning. We're not going to see them here till midday. We'll leave them out this weekend. But very often they had to be included. So they had into the training ground, bit of lunch, recovery, all on the bus again. And then we'd do some work in the hotel that night to get them into the best state they could be. But yeah, that's quite a long answer to say we didn't really have much control of it once they'd gone out that door.
And I guess, you know, the follow-up to that was it much easier to manage when they're back at the club? I mean, would they be reprimanded for that? So, you know, obviously when they're with you, you can probably tell the manager whatever. But when they've come back from an international and they've been a little bit naughty, I mean, what kind of
reprimand? A bit naughty, played too long.
Yeah. I mean, they might have played too long and got injured. What kind of discussions would you have then?
Well, obviously we're making assumptions that those games were friendlies. Then it would be a bit upsetting for the manager and us that a potentially meaningless, in inverted commas, friendly has cost us their services for the next few weeks in the Premier League. But if they were competitive games, we didn't have a leg to stand on. If they were qualifiers for tournaments, they want to get to a tournament, they want to do the best for their country and national team. So what can we say? So that was always hard. But the friendlies were a bit of a killer, yeah, because you wanted them to ideally not go to the friendly, but that was always very difficult. Ideally play minimal amount of minutes in the friendlies, but sometimes we'd have players coming back who played 90 in 2 friendlies, and then you're picking up the pieces when they get back. That's a bit dramatic, picking up the pieces, but you know, with all the travel as well, it was a potentially fatigued player who had to go again 48 hours later.
Did you ever have a national team FA approach you, maybe the reverse way around, and say, do you mind resting him this weekend because we've got an important game next week, whenever, and we want so-and-so to be fresh?
I don't think they'd approach me, first of all. I think it'd be the manager of that team approaching Arsene or whoever's the manager of that team. I don't think they'd go medical team because I wouldn't want to walk into Arsenal's office and say, "Listen, just had a call from France. Any chance you can rest him on Sunday?" I think for the last 2 minutes. But I doubt it. I'd be very surprised if any national team manager has gone to a Premier League manager and said, "Drop him out the weekend." I can't see that.
Well, I guess one of the final discussion points, unless you want to raise anything, Ben, was looking at the FIFA Pro, looking at all these kind of preseason analysis. Brazil are one of the favourite to win the trophy. They're looking really good. They've got a great team together. However, the squad had the second highest back-to-back minutes percentage and the second most minutes played in this FIFA Pro report. They highlighted a lot of them as in the so-called red zone, that they were a danger because of the amount of minutes that they played. Could this actually hinder their chances?
No. Let me expand a little bit. No, I don't see why that's an issue. They've had this little period now, that this week, being very sensible, I'm sure, with experienced people looking after them. I can't see why that would be a problem. I'd much rather that way around than a squad that's had 9 players out injured recently, 9 players that haven't played for their clubs recently. I'd much rather have, going back to that really horrible phrase, in the groove. You know, you've got 26 players that are in the groove of playing every 3 days, every 4 days. I'd much rather that. I'm not sure there's much in the way of heavy fatigue. Here we are, only 4 months into the season. It's that difficult challenge that everyone keeps talking about, that when you go into a tournament, normally it's at the end of a very long season. Now, this tournament here isn't at the end of a very long season. It's at the end of a very long 4 months, 3 months, but it's not the end of a very long season. So, no, I wouldn't think that would hinder Brazil at all. But I get your point, but I don't think so. What do you think? What do you think?
I think that the conditions and the environment out in Qatar will be more of a hindrance to our England team than any fatigue-related issues that may affect the Brazilians. And I suppose that leads into my final question. Again, how will those English players look to maybe, or the backroom staff, look to mitigate those risks associated with those environmental factors? And will those, we talked about recovery strategies and preparations, how will those differ being out in the Middle East as opposed to, how players will be dealt with on a day-to-day basis domestically, in a cold, wet, English, late autumn coming into winter?
The only thing I can really see, it's an obvious thing to say, difference-wise, is just the heat. And so, you keep reading about these air-conditioned stadia, which is lovely, that 10, 12 feet from the ground is apparently really a lot cooler than the temperature outside. Still warm, obviously, but not as hot and humid as the temperature outside of the stadium. But teams have still got to train. And I don't suppose there's any air-conditioned training grounds. So teams have still got to train. So I think it's the heat is the biggest thing they've got to cope with. And again, that would definitely have been considered. They'd have sports scientists and strength coaches getting their heads together, thinking about what's the best way to do it. Do they train at different times in the day to keep it cooler? The converse argument to that would be, do they train when it's quite hot to try and allow the players to have a couple of acclimatized sessions in that heat so it's not new to them on the match day? I don't know which way England have gone, to be honest, or any of the teams. But they'd have thought about it, discussed it. But I can't think of much else they would need to mitigate apart from heat and humidity. I think the rest of it is going to be reasonably straightforward. The facilities look magnificent. I mean, England's hotel and setup looks really good. Everything you possibly need there. So is that what you meant? I can only really see the heat.
Yeah. I mean, and ultimately, Colin, is it coming home?
How on earth do I know? I'm going to duck that one again.
No,
I agree with you that the South Americans perhaps might have a bit of an advantage.
So that's a no.
Let's hope I'm wrong. Play this again.
Talking of recovery strategies, I'm going to cheekily ask one last question. what is it going to look like when players come back from the tournament? How their recovery strategy is going to be managed then? Because, like you said, for the Premier League, it's going to be a few days back. Are they just going to be almost ushered back in? No need to rest because they're still in the, I'm going to say your phrase, in the groove. They're playing at the moment. Some players will be on a sky high. Some will be feeling low after losing the final. What is going to be the management around that?
If we think of it just from a physical point of view, I mean, there's lots of other stuff that goes on, obviously, but let's think of it from the physical side of things. If you get to the final, I think your next Premier League game is it 7 days later? So
yeah,
I'm not convinced many of those players that play in the final will be given much of a break unless they're in the Bundesliga. I'm not sure they're going to get much of a break because I think clubs are going to want them to perform in the Premier League. I might be completely wrong, but the ones that go out in the early rounds, I would think there's probably something in place to give them a short period off and then to get them back in with the team again and start preparing for December 26th. Like we said earlier, I know it's in Qatar, but they've not had any more games than they would have had they been at home anyway. And like we said, arguably less games. So I'm not sure they need to go crazy down the way of recovery unless they get into the semis and the final. But I'll just treat it like any other game.
Yeah.
Give them that care and attention for the 48, 72 hours afterwards. And again, I think if you're getting to the final, Bundesliga aside, I'm just not convinced many teams are going to say off you go in another couple of weeks. I think they'll try and find a way later in the season to give them a break, be it around FA Cup weekends. I don't know.
Yeah.
We did that once after a couple of World Cups. I don't remember what year it was, but players were brought back in soon after the semis and the final because we had a pre-season to go to prepare for the Premier League. But they were promised a bit of time off in January, which they got in a staggered way around FA Cup 3rd and 4th round games.
Yeah. I must admit, I'm expecting incidence levels to drop. I think the biggest issues will come in, cramming in those additional domestic fixtures on the second half of the campaign. I don't think the real issue is around about the World Cup and then returning. It's more what happens post-January onwards when you have those additional European fixtures and those additional domestic fixtures, within that same period, which is going to be, I think, more difficult to manage.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Well, you've broken hearts, Colin, saying football won't be coming home.
Well, Colin will lead with that one.
Yeah,
that's the strap line. That's the
exactly. So yeah, is that what you're going to put? It's not coming home.
Yeah.
Is that the podcast name?
Yeah.
Clickbait.
Colin not coming home, Lewin.
Yeah. Let's hope I'm wrong and you can play this over and over again and make me look silly.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
But it has been a pleasure to speak to you today. And yeah, it has been really fun to talk about Qatar, analysing it, seeing the different elements in terms of injury load management and things to do with that, and the narratives that we're definitely going to see unfold through the season. But I just want to thank you so much for your time again today, Colin.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, Philip.
Superb, Colin. Really, really appreciate that, mate. Thanks a lot.